It was nearly midnight, and Jessica's shift at 7-Eleven was almost over. The store was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every small noise seem amplified. She was organizing the shelves when the lights above her flickered once, twice, and then went completely out, plunging the store into near darkness. Only the hum of the refrigerator lights remained, casting an unsettling glow on the aisles. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She glanced toward the counter where Mike, her coworker, stood motionless, staring at her through the darkness. Something about his gaze unnerved her. There had always been something off about him. He was too quiet, his smile too forced, and the way he seemed to watch her made her skin crawl. "Power outage, huh?" she said nervously, trying to break the tension. Mike didn't respond, just kept staring, his eyes glinting in the dim light. Jessica felt the hairs on her neck stand up. She tried to shrug it off. The uneasy feeling gnawed at her. She walked toward the back room, hoping to find the circuit breaker, when she noticed movement outside the store. 3 shadowy figures stood just beyond the parking lot. Their faces were covered by darkness. They were too far to make out clearly, but the way they lingered sent a shiver down her spine. Jessica's mind raced. Who were they? Why were they just standing there? She turned back to Michael, who hadn't moved. "Do you see those guys outside?" she asked, her voice shaking. "They're with me," Mike said in a low, almost unemotional voice. "We've been watching you for a while." Jessica's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" She stumbled, backing away. Mike's smile twisted into something sinister. "It's time for you to come with us." The realization hit her like a truck. Mike wasn't just creepy. He was dangerous, and those men outside were waiting for her. Without thinking, Jessica bolted toward the door, but Mike was faster. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. She struggled, kicking at him, but he wouldn't let go. "You're not going anywhere," he growled, his face inches from hers. Desperation flooded Jessica's veins, and with a surge of adrenaline, she yanked her hand free and ran. She didn't look back, didn't stop to catch her breath. All she could think about was getting away. The parking lot was eerily empty except for the 3 men who still loomed in the distance. Jessica darted past them, her breath ragged as she sprinted down the dark street. She didn't know where to go. Her house was too far, but her friend Katie lived only a few blocks away. She reached Katie's house, pounding on the door frantically. "Katie, open up, please." The door flew open, and Katie stood there, alarmed. "Jess, what's wrong?" "Call the police now," Jessica yelled, her body trembling. Katie grabbed her phone and dialed, while Jessica collapsed onto the couch, her heart still racing. She couldn't stop thinking about Mike, about the look in his eyes, and the men waiting outside the store. When the police arrived, Jessica explained everything, breathless and panicked. They rushed to the 7-Eleven, lights flashing, but when they arrived, their faces were grim. There was no sign of Michael. One of the officers said he never clocked out. Jessica felt a wave of confusion and dread wash over her. "What do you mean? He was there. He grabbed me. Those men were outside too." "We'll keep investigating," the officers assured her. "But right now, there's no trace of him." Jessica felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. Where had Mike gone? And more importantly, who would be his next victim? She stared out into the night, a cold chill running down her spine. She knew one thing for sure. Mike wasn't done, and somewhere out there in the shadows, he was watching, waiting for his next victim. It was a late night, and the 7-Eleven was quiet. Emma stood behind the counter, half awake, the harsh buzz of the fluorescent lights making her eyelids heavy. It had been a long shift, uneventful like most nights, but something felt wrong tonight. An itch at the back of her mind she couldn't shake. Then she heard it, the low rumble of an engine, sputtering and struggling as it pulled into the lot. Emma glanced up, expecting another late-night customer, but what she saw sent a cold wave of dread through her. A beat-up old truck creaked to a stop, its headlights flickering like they were about to give out. The truck looked like it hadn't been touched in years, rusted, dented, barely holding itself together. The driver's door opened slowly, and out stepped a man. He was tall and lanky, covered in layers of grim that clung to his skin and clothes. His black jacket hung in tatters, ripped at the seams, and his jeans were shattered beyond recognition. His hair was a greasy, tangled mess hanging over his face that hadn't seen a shower in weeks. Emma caught a whiff of him before he even entered the store, a stench of sweat, dirt, and rot. The man shuffled toward the entrance, each step slow and deliberate. Emma's stomach tightened as she watched him through the glass door, her fingers twitching with the urge to call someone, anyone. But before she could act, the door swung open and the man stepped inside. The bell jingled softly, but the sound felt hollow, wrong, like it didn't belong. The air around him seemed to shift, heavier, darker, as he moved through the aisles. Emma swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. "Can I help you?" Her voice trembled. He didn't answer. Instead, he wandered the store, his dirty fingers brushing over the shelves as he moved. The lights above flickered, casting strange shadows along the floor. And for a moment, Emma thought they might go out completely. She watched him from behind the counter, every instinct in her screaming to get out, to leave, but her legs were frozen. The man began grabbing random items, chips, a soda, a candy bar, but it didn't seem like he was interested in them. His movements were slow, too controlled, like he was biding his time. Finally, he approached the counter, dropping the items onto it without a word. Up close, the smell was worse, suffocating. His eyes, dark and sunken, barely seemed to register her. "That'll be $8.47, Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't reply. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled wad of dirty bills. His hands were filthy, the nails cracked and blackened. As he handed her the money, his fingers brushed hers, cold and rough. Emma flinched at the contact, pulling her hand back quickly. He didn't seem to notice. He just stood there staring at her, his eyes, lifeless and hollow, locked onto hers, and the corners of his mouth twitched into a twisted, unsettling smile. "Do you need a bag?" she asked, forcing herself to look away from his piercing gaze. He shook his head slowly, gathering the items, and turned toward the door. Just as he reached the exit, he stopped. Emma felt the air around her freeze. Without turning around, he spoke in a low, raspy voice, each word dripping with something dark, something final. "I'll see you soon." The door swung shut behind him, the bell jingling again in that eerie, off-key way. Emma rushed to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She watched as he climbed into his decrepit truck, the headlights flickering on and off. As the engine sputtered to life, slowly he drove off, disappearing into the night. Empty road. For the rest of the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching her. His words echoed in her mind, over and over. "I'll see you soon." The store felt colder, the shadows longer, and every small sound made her jump. But he never came back. Weeks passed, and the man with the dirty, tattered clothes became a distant memory. Until one morning, 6 weeks later, Jessica saw a face on the news that made her blood run cold. It was him, that midnight stranger. The news anchor's voice was grim as she spoke. Police have identified the man arrested for a string of brutal murders across the state. Authorities believe he may have been involved in several disappearances over the past year. His victims, mostly young women, were stalked for weeks before vanishing. Investigators found evidence linking him to more than a dozen cases. Emma felt her heart stop as the screen flashed his mugshot. The same hollow eyes, the same filthy hair, and the same twisted smile. He was a murderer. The man who had stood in front of her, close enough to touch, had been hunting people like her. The anchor's voice continued, but Emma couldn't hear it. Over the pounding of her own heartbeat, she could only think of one thing. He said he'd see me soon, and in that moment, she realized how close she had come to being his next victim. It was a typical graveyard shift at the 7-Eleven. The store was quiet, and I was busy restocking shelves, trying to stay awake as the clock ticked past midnight. That's when he came in. He wasn't hard to miss. An overweight man with greasy hair, wearing a shirt 2 sizes too small, his pale belly spilling out. He didn't say a word as he wandered through the aisles, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. His gaze was unsettling, lingering too long, like he was trying to remember what I looked like. I ignored it and tried to push off the discomfort. People like him came in sometimes. Harmless, right? But when I looked up to ring him out, his eyes were still locked on me, and a sick smile crept across his face. "Have a good night," I said, forcing a polite tone, trying to end the interaction quickly. He didn't reply, just stood there for a moment staring. Then he finally turned and walked out, still looking back at me, through the glass door as he left. I shrugged it off, but something about him stuck with me. I shook it off and continued my shift, hoping that was the last I'd see of him. The next few days were fine until I started noticing him again. First, he showed up during my shift again, hovering in the store without buying anything. Then I saw him standing outside the 7-Eleven when I got off work, watching me across the street. My skin crawled. It was getting harder to ignore the fact that he wasn't just some random creepy customer. He was following me. One night I got home late, thinking I lost him. But when I glanced out my window, there he was. He was standing on the sidewalk across the street, staring directly at my house. Panic shot through me. I shut the blinds and turned off the lights. I stayed up late that night, heart pounding in my chest. Every creak of the house felt like a threat, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there. I barely slept, but when morning came, I hoped it was over. It wasn't. The next night I heard a sound that froze in my place, a loud, frantic knocking on my front door. His voice followed, loud and deranged. "Let me in," he screamed. "I know you're in there. Open up now." My blood turned ice. I crept toward the door and peeked out the window, my heart racing. He was standing right outside, holding a gun. Sweat poured down his face as he shouted, "Don't make me do something you'll regret," he threatened, banging harder. I ran, ducking into the hallway, turning off every light. As I went, the sound of gunshots shattered the silence, bullets ripping through the front door. I dropped to the floor, crawling to my phone with trembling hands, and I called 911. "Please hurry," I whispered to the dispatcher. "He's shooting at my house." The police arrived within minutes, and I heard sirens through the night air. As they pulled up, the stalker took off running down the street, but they caught him. When they wrestled him into cuffs, he turned back to look at me, smiling as if he won some sick game. A few days later, the police told me something even more disturbing. They searched his house and found dozens of pictures of me. Pictures from my shifts at 7-Eleven, pictures of me at the gym, even pictures of me grabbing food at McDonald's. He'd been following me for weeks, maybe longer. Working the late night shift at 7-Eleven wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. It was usually quiet after midnight, except for the occasional drunk customer or some insomniac looking for snacks. My coworker Brian worked the same shift, and while he wasn't the chatty type, there was something about him that almost made me uncomfortable. He was tall, lanky, and always wore a blank expression. His eyes, cold, emotionless, seemed to follow me every time I moved. One night as I restocked the shelves, I noticed Brian staring at me from behind the counter. His gaze wasn't just casual, it was unsettling, like he was studying me. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was just a coworker, right? But things got worse. Brian started showing in places he didn't belong, standing too close in the stockroom, his eyes lingering a little too long. His presence made my skin crawl, and I began avoiding him as much as possible. Then one night I made a mistake. I ventured into the stockroom late during my break. I thought it would be empty. It wasn't. I walked in and froze. Brian was there, standing at the back, looking through a box I hadn't seen before. His back was to me, so I quietly stepped back, but not before I caught a glimpse of what was inside. Photos, dozens of them, all women, some of them I recognized, familiar faces of 7-Eleven workers who had been transferred or quit. The pictures were taped together in some kind of twisted collection. My heart raced as I looked closer, realizing that I was in some of those pictures too. Photos of me stocking shelves, talking to customers, even arriving to work. I felt sick. Suddenly, Brian turned around and his eyes looked on me. His face didn't change, still as blank as ever, but now there was something wrong in his stare. I quickly turned around and bolted out of the stockroom. My heart pounding in my chest, I ran to the counter pretending to look busy, but inside, panic rose like a tide. What the hell was Brian doing with those photos? Why did he have so many? The rest of the night dragged on in tense silence. Brian didn't say a word, but I could feel him watching me. I barely got through my shift. The next day I couldn't shake the image of those pictures. I decided to do some digging. I started asking around about the women in the photos. One had transferred to another 7-Eleven, another had quit suddenly. But there was a pattern. None of them had been heard from since they left. They had vanished. No social media, no contact with any who worked there. It was as if they disappeared without a trace, and every one of them had worked a late shift with Brian. Panic bubbled inside me. Could Brian have something to do with their disappearances? The next night I decided to confront him. I wanted answers. I waited till the store was empty and quiet, and cornered him in the stockroom. "Brian," I started, my voice shaking a little. "What's with all those pictures?" His face didn't change, but his eyes darkened. "What pictures?" he said, his tone cold. I swallowed, trying to stay calm. "The ones in the back. The photos of the workers. Of me." For a moment he just stared at me, his silence more terrifying than anything. Then a slow, chilling smile crept onto his face. "You've been snooping," he said, taking a step closer. "I don't like that." My heart raced. I backed up, but he kept coming, cornering me against the wall. "You think you know what's going on, but you don't," he whispered, leaning in close. "Those women, they all wanted to leave, but I made sure they stayed, one way or another." My heart pounding in my throat. It wasn't just photos, he had done something to them. My mind raced, putting the pieces together. Brian wasn't just watching us, he was stalking us, and worse, he was killing us. "You're insane," I said, trying to push past him, but his hand shot out, grabbing my arm tightly. "You should have minded your business," he said. "Now you're next." I broke free and ran toward the front of the store, heart pounding in my ears. I grabbed my phone, frantically dialing 911. As I locked the front doors behind me, Brian's footsteps echoed behind me, growing louder as he followed. I ducked behind the counter, breathless, praying for the police to come quickly. Brian was closer now, his slow, deliberate footsteps growing louder. I could hear him muttering under his breath, something about how I ruined everything. Suddenly the glass doors shattered. Brian had picked up a metal shelf and slammed it through the front windows. My breath caught in my throat as I scrambled for the back exit, my heart pounding in my ears. I sprinted out into the alleyway, just as the sound of sirens filled the air. The police arrived within moments. They found Brian standing in the shattered doorway, smiling. When they searched him, they found more photos, hundreds of them, all of his co-workers, all of us. Some of the women he had killed had been missing for months, their faces now haunting evidence of his obsession. When they searched his house, they found even more. Pictures, trophies, and worst of all, evidence that he had been watching us long before we ever realized. As they took him away, Brian looked back at me with that same unsettling smile. His eyes locked on mine, and he whispered one final word as they dragged him into the police car. "Soon." Even though he was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling of that nightmare wasn't over. So I quit my job at 7-Eleven.